Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're looking at part 5 of the Pseudoscience Uprising series. This is part of a series, so you can go ahead and start with part 1 if you're new here. Or not. I can't tell you what to do. I'm not your daddy. Stop calling me daddy. Just, roll the intro.
The life we have on Earth must have spontaneously generated itself.
Scientists have reason to think that the first living cells on Earth came about through a natural process called chemical evolution. First living cell chemical evolution.
Are they trolling us? These scenarios where people are sitting around watching science and philosophy videos are getting weirder and weirder. We started off watching Cosmos in a pub, which is weird, but it's not entirely implausible. Maybe they just had a TV going and Cosmos came on. Okay, fine. But now we're at a point where we're expected to believe that an entire football stadium was watching a science video that they had to interrupt? Not to mention the guy relaxing on his couch with a glass of wine just chilling and watching Stated Clearly, or the old ladies playing dominoes while watching Stephen Hawking. Come on, guys, at least try to keep it plausible.
Did life really spontaneously generate itself from chemicals?
Okay, firstly here, I don't like that wording. Spontaneous generation means something specific, and it is something that was found to be wrong over a century ago. Abiogenesis is the word for the origin of life. Secondly, every time a pregnancy occurs, that is literally life being generated from chemicals, so I don't see what your problem is with that.
Has science shown this?
No, science has not conclusively demonstrated abiogenesis. It is still one of the unknowns. But let's start with the facts, shall we? We know that evolution happens. Fact. Life gets simpler the further back we look. Fact. The logical extrapolation of this is that a very simple life form was the first thing to come into existence that could be referred to as life. We do not know how this happened, but we do know that life started at some point at least 3.8 billion years ago, possibly as far back as 4.1 billion years ago, though probably not that old.
We tracked down James Tour, one of the world's leading experts in synthetic organic chemistry, to find out.
Ah yes, James Tour. He is also one of the world's leading God of the Gaps proponents. His name is by far the most common name that creation has sent to me at the moment, daring me to respond to him, but so far the only thing that I've actually seen from him is a detailed explanation of the parts of abiogenesis that are still unknown, and the resulting, therefore it must have been God. It's the God of the Gaps with big words, that's all it boils down to. I really hope he says something more interesting here than he does in his other videos, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
All of these little pictures of molecules coming together to form the first cell are fallacious, are ridiculous. The origin of life community has not been honest. They will write in their very papers, they will see some small phenomenon and extrapolate what this means in the context of origin of life.
I mean, extrapolation is really all we can do with abiogenesis until such a time as we figure out a way to replicate it in a lab, and even then, there will be no guarantee that the way we figured it out is the way it actually happened in nature.
And then they will work with the press, and the press will extrapolate it all the more.
In my experience, the press just does that all on their own. If anything, scientists get annoyed when the press make grandiose claims about the implication of their research. One of the imperfections in our system of how science gets funded is that we look too much for specific applications for everything, so in order to secure future funding, scientists will often include in their conclusions a list of potential real-world implications should their findings hold true when further research is done on that topic. The press has a knack for picking the flashiest of these implications and blowing it way out of proportion to make it seem like a much bigger deal than it is. A great example of this recently is all the press surrounding the cell phone use causing us to grow horns. The paper that is cited for this claim didn't even look into a connection with cell phone use. It also didn't use a random sample of participants. They looked at people that were already attending one of the study author's chiropractic clinics, so it was not representative of the general population. They found small, less than 3 centimeter protuberances, which they did not call horns in the paper, but the Washington Post labeled horns. There are more issues with this paper, but it is a great great example of media sensationalism. And yes, origin of life research suffers from a similar problem. I've seen pop science publications several times over the years declare that the mystery of the origin of life has finally been solved, when really it's just that a bit more progress has been made towards solving the mystery. But a huge chunk of the mystery still remains. Sensationalism sells.
And you get many, many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made. All of this is a lie.
Aside from sensationalized headlines, I am completely unaware of anyone trying to suggest that they have successfully created living cells in a lab completely from scratch. Artificial DNA has been done, and that one certainly did have some headlines that could have left the impression that we've created life. But when looking for research of this kind, the most recent item that I found is a lab that started up in 2017 with the goal of building living cells completely from scratch with a handcrafted genome. Their goal is to do it in 10 years, placing the estimated completion, if they should succeed, in 2027. So nobody is claiming to have completely designed life from scratch, and nobody is claiming to have replicated abiogenesis. If people are left with the impression that either of these things have been done, then it is a combination of sensationalized headlines and people's tendencies to not read past the headlines. I'm not saying that this isn't an issue that should be addressed, because it absolutely is. Sensationalized headlines are a plague on society, in my opinion, but just because something has been overhyped does not make the underlying science false.
Scientist Craig Venter creates life for the first time in a laboratory.
Yep, that is a good example of sensationalism in this area. He did some amazing groundbreaking work, but if you read past the headline, you'll see that they describe the process that he used, and it makes it quite clear that he was not creating life from scratch. What he did was sequence the genome of the smallest known bacteria, Mycoplasma genitalium, side note, Teehee genitalium. He then stored the genetic sequence on a computer. He modified the sequence slightly to give it a watermark to distinguish it from its wild counterparts. Then he stripped some bacteria of their genetic material and substituted his watermarked DNA. So yes, sensationalized headline. That's a problem. But if you read past the headline, you'll see that they were not trying to pretend that what he did was anything close to replicating abiogenesis. In fact, the whole article whose headline you read doesn't even mention anything about this being linked to the origin of life. It's about creating designer microbes to do what he wants them to do, like capture carbon or speed up vaccine production. It has nothing to do with abiogenesis.
We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell.
Yeah, notice there that he said the first synthetic cell. He didn't say he created life, he said he manufactured a synthetic cell, which he did. That's not a lie.
We haven't created life, nowhere close.
Nope, we sure haven't. Not sure why that's relevant. There were literally hundreds of thousands of years where humans hadn't been able to create devices that were heavier than air and would fly. Does that mean that flight was impossible for hundreds of thousands of years from the time humans first evolved until the Wright brothers? Nope. That just means that our understanding of the mechanisms of flight was imperfect for that time period. To look at something and say humans have not accomplished it yet, therefore it's impossible, is the height of arrogance.
What they did is they took a cell. They took the genome out of that cell, they manufactured a genome that's similar to it, and they put it in.
Yeah, that is what they did. And that's exactly what the article that you showed about it explained that they did. Like I said, you gotta read past the headlines.
That is akin to taking an engine out of a Ford and putting it into a Buick and then saying, look, I created automobiles.
No, it is not, and you should know better. There is no automotive analogy that really fits here because the car itself does not contain the instructions for its own replication, which is what DNA is. Your comparison would work better if it was the flagellar motor that was swapped out, but it wasn't. It was the genetic material. The fact that they were able to mess around with the genome of an organism, create a new chromosome, and then the organism still survived and reproduced after their custom genetic code was inserted is amazing. Yes, it is not creating life from scratch, but it is still pretty fucking sweet.
No, you just took one piece, and it's not even the engine, it's just the computer control box.
So wait, cars have a computer control box that makes them self-replicating now?
You took out of one car and you put it in another car. That's what it was like.
No, it wasn't, and you're oversimplifying to the point of dishonesty.
Other scientists say they've been able to create protocells in the lab that are the stepping stones to the first life.
I mean, making a phospholipid bilayer is a pretty straightforward procedure, and that could be called a protocell. So depending on your definition of protocell, it's actually pretty easy. Scientists have also made a phospholipid bilayer that contains DNA and proteins that will self-replicate when they adjust the pH level of the surroundings. Scientists have made membraneless cells that are able to exchange RNA molecules that group together in microdroplets. Yeah, they probably grabbed all this genetic information from something that already exists rather than writing it from scratch, but all that means is that we don't have a full understanding of everything that the genetic material does yet, and nobody is claiming that we do. So yes, we have made protocells. No, we have not made them in a way that would demonstrate abiogenesis in a lab, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody is claiming that we have.
I can mix some chemicals together in a test tube in my lab, and these chemicals will start to self-associate to form larger and larger structures. The protocell moves as a metabolism, it could use energy, and it moves around.
Fun fact about the clip you just played, Martin Hanksizik, Martin, last name with not enough vowels, explained how he was using the term protocell at the beginning of the talk.
Well, we use a model system that we term a protocell. You might think of this as kind of like a primitive cell. It is a simple chemical model of a living cell. And if you consider, for example, a cell in your body may have in the order of millions of different types of molecules that need to come together, play together in a complex network to produce something that we call alive. In the laboratory, what we want to do is much the same, but with on the order of tens of different types of molecules. So a drastic reduction in complexity, but still trying to produce something that looks lifelike.
So it looks like he's using the term protocell here as a model for a simple cell-like structure that behaves in a somewhat lifelike manner. He then goes on in that very talk to explain that this is exactly what he did. He also explained how these protocells wouldn't have been found in nature. They were too simple, as a matter of fact. He was able to make protocells easily with only 5 chemicals that metabolize, move, reproduce, seek out energy sources, and more behaviors that are generally associated with life. But then he pointed out that the early Earth would not have been a pure lab condition with only 5 chemicals. It would have been a messy clay or tar with a bunch of different chemicals mixed in together. So then he did the same thing with an impure tarry substance. Go watch his talk. It's actually very fascinating.
Protocells are a bunch of nonsense. That is like a proto-turkey.
It only looks silly to you because you started with the assumption that it's impossible. But you literally had a video of a guy showing basic cell-like structures behaving in a way that is very similar to life with only 5 chemicals. It's a structure that is very similar to a living cell in both structure and behavior, but it's much simpler and wouldn't actually qualify as a living cell. Ergo, protocell. You just object to the proto part because that particular prefix usually means first or earliest form of, so it assumes that not only was there an earliest cell, but that it was simpler than the ones we have today. And since this assumption is supported by everything we know about evolution, there's no reason to assume that it's wrong at this point. Also, here's a picture of a proto-turkey. Okay, I lied, it's actually a proto-chicken, but that's only because pictures of turkey embryos are surprisingly hard to find.
I take 20 pounds of sliced turkey meat from a delicatessen. I throw that into a pot. I add some turkey broth. I warm that up, and I throw in some feathers, and I say, that's a proto-turkey.
Man, you are really bad at analogies. Does it behave like a turkey? No. But the protocells that Professor No Vowels was showing were behaving in ways that are similar to actual cells. So for your analogy to work, his experiments would have had to just not do anything. No self-assembling phospholipid bilayers, no metabolism, no locomotion. But they did all these things, so there you have it, protocells.
Yeah, there's no order to it, but if you wait long enough, a turkey will come gobbling out. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yep, it sure does, and it's not even close to an accurate analogy, so ultimately it doesn't matter.
That's precisely what origin of life researchers have done when they make a protocell.
Did you see that, though? Did you see the thing that happened in the video that you yourselves are showing? Did you see how the protocell is moving? It also sought out food that was put in the dish with it. Did your turkey soup do that? No? Then maybe it's not an apt comparison. Maybe don't display the reason your analogy doesn't work while you're talking about why your analogy does work.
Wait a second. Haven't we been taught with hundreds of millions of years anything is possible?
I mean, not anything. Certainly a great number of improbable things will happen given enough time, but some things are impossible. For instance, the existence of a god as described by the Bible. But here we have basic chemical soups producing protocells with some very lifelike qualities. Give it enough time and the right environment, and eventually turning into simple life is definitely within the realm of possibility.
Time is actually the enemy. You let these chemicals that have been made sit around. They show the degradation in a period of weeks. Weeks is the twinkling of an eye when it comes to prebiotic timescales.
Yeah, that is one of the problems. We're not sure how these molecules would have survived long enough to plausibly end up at life. But this is where time comes back in as a friend. There are an estimated 40 billion Earth-sized planets orbiting in the habitable zones of their stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone. There are an estimated 100 billion galaxies in the universe. That's about 4 million trillion potentially life-supporting planets in the universe, and in several billion years, it is likely that on at least one of these, the environment developed in such a way that it would allow life to form. The fact that we, as life forms, live on one such planet is rather unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. Maybe there was a way for these chemicals to stay stable long enough to develop into life. Maybe, in a remarkable coincidence, it all happened rather quickly at least once. Both of these options are very improbable, but given how many planets probably had little organic chemical soups going and how old the universe is, the fact that it ended up happening at least once is unremarkable.
The chemicals decompose. So to think that the molecules could be made and sit there waiting for other molecules to come in, it doesn't happen. Organic chemistry doesn't work that way.
Or, bear with me here, maybe there was some chemical interaction that we haven't thought of yet that would prolong the lives of these molecules, or would make the next step faster so it would happen before the molecules destabilize. It is possible that we don't know enough about how organic chemistry works to have figured out exactly what happened yet, and to sit there yelling angrily about the fact that we don't know yet, therefore it's impossible, just makes you look silly.
Well, if life didn't spontaneously generate on Earth, what about scientists who believe that life must have come here from outer space?
Please, pretty please do not bring up the fact that this just pushes the question back a step instead of solving it as some sort of gotcha that nobody has ever thought of before. Please, I'm begging you. Nobody who seriously considers panspermia is unaware of this fact. Just don't go there. Just don't. Don't even. Just don't.
Whether you want to have it originate from Earth or from some other planet, you have to have the origin of life. You have to have the origin of that first cell.
Oh, fuck your face.
How does that happen? We have no idea.
Well, we do have some ideas, but first let me go back to, once again, the very article you were showing while you were talking about this. Let's just read the damn headlines, since you guys don't seem to be fans of reading past the headlines. Ingredients for life found in meteorites that crashed to Earth. What part of that even comes close to suggesting that life itself formed in outer space? Meteorites are one of several answers to the question of where amino acids could have come from. Do you know what the article actually says was found on the meteorites? Amino acids, water, hydrocarbons, and other organic matter. Not life, ingredients that have the potential to become life.
So with all the advances in scientific research and the study of life, why can't we figure this out?
Because it's a really difficult question? Why don't you start researching the mechanisms of a very specific chemical reaction that happened 4 billion years ago which didn't leave any detectable traces of itself? I like how you keep jumping back and forth between this should be easy and this is super duper complicated. You talk about how complicated it is when pointing out how little we actually know about how abiogenesis could have happened, and then immediately flip the script to we've made so many other scientific advances, surely this one should be easy when it suits you.
With all of origin of life research going on, the problem is becoming harder all the time.
Yeah, that happens sometimes in science. As you learn more about something, you learn how much more difficult it is than what you thought it was going to be going in. Anyone who's ever volunteered to coach kids' sports teams knows exactly what I'm talking about, am I right? I mean, just look at scientific progress in physics. Newton came up with his laws of motion, which are fairly simple. But as we learn more about how the universe works, we come to realize that his laws of motion are actually wrong. It's much more complicated than that and needed the theory of relativity to properly explain it. But then as we learn even more about how the universe works, we learn that the theory of relativity is too simple to properly describe what's going on, so we turn to quantum mechanics, which is vastly more complex. Newton's laws of motion work well enough on a large scale, so we still use them, and the theory of relativity works well enough on scales above the quantum level, so we still use it. But the more we learn about how the universe works, the more we find out we don't actually know. Why would the origin of life be any different?
Not easier. And the reason it's become harder is because we understand more about the complexity of a cell.
That's the first thing you've said that actually makes sense. Well done. Now, why does this mean it didn't happen? I've already explained how things tend to get more complicated as we learn more about them, and this is normal, but this doesn't just cause us to abandon the study of quantum mechanics because it just must be beyond us, so God did it. It causes us to do further research so we can get an even better understanding of what's going on. Why is the origin of life different?
To help explain the complexity of living cells, we turn to molecular biologist Douglas Axe.
To get an idea of the complexity of a living cell, think of a factory with thousands of pieces of machinery all working together to do some coordinated task.
Okay, yeah, fine, you can make another analogy. Stuff works together. Lots of things work together in our bodies. Therefore, similar things couldn't possibly have done it in a simpler way in the past, even though we have demonstrated similar things doing it in a simpler way in the present.
A cell is actually far more complicated than that factory because factories don't maintain themselves. People have to maintain factories, and factories certainly don't make new factories. Whereas with a living cell, all the parts that wear out are automatically remanufactured within the cell. Not only that, the cell is manufacturing a new cell as well. Human-made factories don't even come close.
Interesting how you bring up that key difference when trying to impress us with how complicated cells are, but you always leave out that part when you compare evolution to man-made machines. You know, since replication is the key difference that makes comparing evolution to manufacturing a bad analogy. Glad to know that you're aware of this very important distinction.
For a living cell to exist and perform such complex tasks, it takes some very detailed instructions.
For the complex tasks, yes. But as has already been stated in this video, it would have started very simply. Just moving towards an energy source does not require complex instructions,
which are chemically encoded in our DNA.
If you have a string of nucleic acids like DNA or RNA has, you have to have a precise sequence.
Sometimes, yes, but there are a lot of imprecise sequences in our genetic code. In fact, that's one of the ways that we know evolution actually happened. We can trace the mutations that don't do anything. If the code had to be precise, you couldn't just mess with it and expect nothing to happen, but as it turns out, this happens at a pretty consistent rate.
Because that translates to what proteins are needed to build the organism. That's called the information code.
And here I thought it was called the genetic code. Now a quick Google search for the information code doesn't even take me to creationist sites. I found stuff on the information code on driver's licenses and information codes that come up on certain brands of washing machines when there's a problem, but it doesn't appear that the information code is a scientific term of any kind, not even one used by creationists. But pedantry aside, yes, the genetic code does translate into proteins, and I thought this was fairly obvious, but the simpler life forms wouldn't have needed all that many of them. But then again, you guys seem to be oblivious to the fact that anyone who talks about panspermia is aware that life had to start somewhere, so maybe you're oblivious to this too. So the ones that happened to produce proteins would have had an advantage over the ones that did not, and the ones that produce proteins that were more helpful would then have had an advantage over the ones that were less helpful, and so on.
But where did all that information, these detailed instructions, come from to build the first cell?
The first cell would not have been that complex. It wouldn't need all the information required to build, say, epithelial cells. It would have just been a single-celled organism that is able to metabolize and reproduce. We've already seen that this can be done very minimalistically, so it stands to reason that when genetic material started getting involved, this would also have started out minimalistically.
We don't have a tool to assess that within chemistry.
And for hundreds of thousands of years, we didn't have a tool to assess the temperature of the sun's photosphere, but that does not mean that it wasn't around 5,500 degrees Celsius until we could measure it. Perhaps one day we will invent a tool to assess that, but we definitely won't if we just stop here and say God did it.
Laboratory chemistry may not, but Stephen Meyer is convinced origin science does have the tools.
Wait, this creationist philosopher is convinced that origin science does have the tools to assess where the information comes from? Great, let's hear about this.
Is there anything we know of that does have the causal power, the ability to generate new information, and therefore could explain the origin of the first cell?
Yeah, there is. Evolution by natural selection. And we were just talking about how we don't quite know where it came from in abiogenesis yet, and you were about to tell us what tool we can use to figure it out, so this should be groundbreaking.
And I think there is, and that's the idea of intelligent design.
Okay, so your answer to the question of how did this thing happen is to tell us who did it, but not explain any of the mechanisms used? How is this supposed to be helpful? Science without intelligent design is just a question of how the stuff happened. Intelligent design just puts a who behind the how. We still need to know how in order to advance science, even if you are right, which you're not.
Intelligent design is defined as the theory that certain features of the natural world are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process.
Yeah, the theory that a who done did it, but we don't know how he done did it, and we best not even ask. He just done did it in them mysterious ways.
Because what we know from our experience is that intelligent agents can produce information, and indeed do produce information, in a digital or typographic form, the form of information that we find in the DNA molecule.
This just seems like a rehashing of part 3. So rather than redo the whole thing, I'll just put a nifty little card in the corner. There you go. Nice cute little eye. Go ahead and give that buddy a little clicky poo if you somehow got to part 5 without seeing part 3 first.
Don't be fooled by the hype. Materialists are further from explaining the origin of life than ever before.
What? Yeah, I'll agree that this subject does tend to get overhyped in the popular press, but we are making progress. How is a better understanding of molecular biology putting us further away from understanding the process by which simple molecules became biology than ever before? I mean, I know in your worldview the correct answer was the one arrived at by the Bronze Age nomadic goat herders thousands of years ago, but you have to be able to step outside of that worldview for a second to just listen to how ridiculous that sounds. If I am not convinced that your God exists, then do you really expect statements about how primitive nomadic tribes of people knew more about science than scientists do today to convince me? Or is it just laughable? But that's okay. I know you're not really looking to convince anyone, you're just out to reassure people who already agree with you. And for that, it might work. So that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nemo. Hey Marlon, I found Nemo. Twice. Anyway, Nemo says, your dice analogy is stupid because you started out with the dice and that's what you don't understand about random chance. So let me break it down simple so you can understand it. Take your cell phone and break it apart, and we already knew it worked from the beginning, and now sit it on the ground and tell me how many billions of years it's going to take for it to put itself together. Oh, by the way, I'm giving you an evolutionary head start by allowing the phone to already be coded to work when it randomly puts itself back together. Well, Nemo, let me break this down simple so you can understand it. A broken cell phone won't reproduce, so there's nothing for natural selection to work on. Reproduction is a key part of evolution. Find a new analogy which includes reproduction, then we can talk. Links for social media and ways to support the channel are in the description, as well as my P.O. Box address if you want to send me shit. Please don't send me literal shit. See you next time.